December 1944. The Ardennes forest was a monochrome etching of a world bled of warmth and colour. Snow, thick and suffocating, draped the pines in shrouds of white, muffling the sounds of a war that had ground on for an eternity. For the men of the Kampfgruppe, veterans of the blood-soaked Eastern Front, this was familiar territory. The cold was an old comrade, the gnawing hunger a constant companion. They were ghosts in grey, their faces chiselled by frost and fatigue, their eyes holding the flat, unblinking stare of men who had seen the absolute depths of human depravity and found a home there. Their minds were fortresses, built brick by brick from the granite of National Socialist ideology. They were the master race, the inheritors of a martial tradition stretching back to the Teutonic Knights. Their enemies were a gallery of caricatures painted by the masterful hand of propaganda. The Russians were subhuman hordes, the British were decadent imperialists, and the Americans were the most contemptible of all. They were a nation of jazz-addled shopkeepers, a mongrel race of capitalists and cowboys, softened by luxury and spoiled by an abundance they could not comprehend. Their soldiers, they had been told, were poorly trained, poorly led, and possessed no stomach for a real fight. They were boys playing at war, sent to die by plutocrats in Washington. The German soldiers clutched their rifles, the cold steel a reassuring promise of their own superiority. They had faced the Russian winter, they had broken the French in weeks, they had stared into the abyss and made it blink. What were these Americans but the final, flimsy obstacle on the path to a victory foretold by the Führer himself? Every whispered rumor reinforced this belief. Tales of Americans surrendering in droves, of their incompetence in the field, of their moral weakness. This offensive, this great surge through the Ardennes, would be the final brutal lesson. They would shatter this fragile army and send the remnants fleeing back to their comfortable homes across the sea. The world they knew was one of stark, simple truths. Strength was the only virtue, pity was a fatal weakness, and the enemy was deserving of nothing but a swift, violent end. This conviction was not merely taught, it was forged in the crucible of the Ostfront. They had seen what happened to the weak. They had participated in a war of annihilation where mercy was a concept as foreign as a hot meal. Their own medical services were a testament to this brutal calculus. A sanitator was a practical man, equipped with little more than paper bandages and a grim understanding of triage. A serious wound was often a death sentence. There were no miracles, no vast logistical chains ferrying wounded men to safety. There was only the cold, hard reality of survival. A man who could no longer fight was a burden. A life was weighed against its utility to the Reich. This was the natural order of things, the law of the wolf pack. And it was this world-view, this armor of cynical certainty, that they carried with them into the snow-draped forests of Belgium, fully expecting to see their own harsh reflection in the eyes of their new enemy. But the reality that would soon crash down upon them was not made of steel and fire, but of something far more incomprehensible, a quiet, stubborn compassion. If you find this exploration of wartime psychology compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into history's forgotten moments. The first crack in their fortress of certainty appeared amid the cacophony of an American counterattack. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of screaming shells and the stuttering roar of machine gun fire. Trees, ancient and proud, were splintered into kindling. The snow was churned into a brown, bloody slurry. For a German machine gunner named Hans, his world shrank to the narrow view of his sights and the rhythmic shudder of his MG-42. Then, a searing pain, a white-hot flash in his leg, and the world tilted sideways. He was down, his leg a ruin of shattered bone and torn flesh, the pristine snow around him blossoming with a grotesque crimson flower. His comrades, those who were still alive, were falling back, their grey forms swallowed by the blizzard. He was alone. The teachings of his training, the experiences of 5 years of war, told him what came next, a final defiant shot at the advancing enemy, or a slow freezing death alone in the woods, or, if they found him, a bayonet to the gut. It was the accepted, unwritten rule. A wounded enemy was a problem to be solved, not a life to be saved. He watched through a haze of pain as the American soldiers advanced, their olive-drab forms moving cautiously through the shattered trees. One of them spotted him. Hans fumbled for his pistol, his fingers numb and clumsy. The American soldier raised his rifle. This was it, the end. But instead of the sharp crack of a Garand, a voice shouted something unintelligible. The soldier lowered his weapon. Another figure emerged from the swirling snow, moving with a strange, urgent purpose. This man wore a helmet like the others, but emblazoned on its front was a stark red cross on a white circle. He carried no rifle, only a heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He ran, half-crouched, not away from the sound of the guns, but toward it, toward Hans. The German soldier watched, bewildered. Was this a trick, a new form of psychological warfare? The medic knelt beside him, oblivious to the sporadic gunfire still echoing through the forest. He produced a pair of shears and cut away Hans's trousers, his movements efficient and professional. The German soldiers who witnessed this from a distance, before their own capture or retreat, could not process what they were seeing. They saw an American medic, a non-combatant by any definition they understood, expose himself to active fire to tend to an enemy soldier. He worked with a calm intensity, applying a tourniquet, sprinkling sulfur powder into the wound, injecting a syringe of morphine into Hans's thigh. He spoke in a low, reassuring tone, the words meaningless but the intent somehow impossibly clear. It made no sense. This was not the behavior of a soft, cowardly enemy. It was not the behavior of a pragmatic victor. It was something else entirely, something so alien to their own experience of total war that their minds recoiled from it, unable to categorize or comprehend it. It had to be an anomaly, a fluke, a single soldier acting against orders for reasons they couldn't fathom. They had been trained to see the world as a battlefield of absolutes, but what they were witnessing was a profound and unsettling contradiction. If this clash of ideologies on the battlefield fascinates you, please consider liking this video and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Their disbelief hardened into a collective, cynical theory as more of them were captured in the ensuing days. The men, now disarmed and herded into makeshift collection points behind the American lines, saw it happen again. And again. A German lieutenant, his arm shredded by shrapnel, was laid on a stretcher next to an American GI with a gut wound. The same medics, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion, moved between them, their hands working with the same tireless urgency on both friend and foe. The Germans watched with narrowed, suspicious eyes. It was a show, they concluded, propaganda. They were performing for a hidden camera, creating a film to be shown back in America to prove their moral superiority. They whispered this theory among themselves, the logic a comforting balm on their fractured certainty. It was the only explanation that fit within their framework of the world. A government as cynical as their own was simply better at hiding its true nature. These medics were actors, their compassion a carefully scripted performance. This belief was shattered when they were moved further back, to a sprawling field hospital. Here there were no cameras, no audiences, only the grim, relentless industry of saving lives. The scale of the operation was staggering. It was a city of canvas and steel, humming with the sound of generators, staffed by an army of doctors, nurses, and orderlies. Wounded men, American and German alike, were brought in on an endless conveyor belt of misery. And here, the Germans saw the system in its unvarnished, undeniable entirety. Triage was conducted not by nationality, but by the severity of the wound. A German with a punctured lung was rushed into surgery ahead of an American with a broken arm. They saw plasma bottles hanging from IV stands, a miracle of modern medicine they had only heard whispers of. They were given penicillin, a drug that seemed to halt infection with magical speed. Their filthy, blood-caked uniforms were cut away and replaced with clean pajamas. The cognitive dissonance was becoming a physical ache, a pressure building behind their eyes. This was not propaganda. Propaganda was posters and speeches. It was fragile and easily broken. This was logistics. This was infrastructure. This was a system, vast and complex and terrifyingly efficient, built around a principle that was the polar opposite of their own. They saw medics work for 36 hours straight, their hands trembling from exhaustion, but their focus unbroken. They saw them grieve for a lost patient, American or German, and then turn immediately to the next, their professionalism a shield against despair. The Germans, lying on clean cots, their wounds treated with a level of care they had not thought possible even for their own generals, were forced to confront a truth their ideology could not explain. The enemy they had been taught to despise, the soft and decadent Americans, possessed a capacity for organized compassion that bordered on the superhuman. It was a power far more intimidating than a tank or a bomber, for it attacked not their bodies, but the very foundations of their belief system. Help us continue to tell these powerful stories by supporting our channel on Patreon. Every contribution helps us uncover more of history's most impactful moments. This was the beginning of a profound and painful internal reckoning. Lying in the sterile quiet of the hospital tents, the German soldiers began to compare. The process was involuntary, a constant looping reel of memory playing against the stark reality of their present. They remembered their own journey to the front. They remembered the lazaret, the German field hospitals on the Eastern Front. Those were not places of healing, but charnel houses, way stations on the road to death. They remembered the smell, a thick, sweet miasma of gangrene, unwashed bodies, and despair. They remembered the screams that went unanswered, the desperate shortage of everything. Bandages, morphine, doctors. A man's life was cheap, far cheaper than the fuel needed to evacuate him. They remembered their own sanitator, brave men, yes, but hamstrung by a system that had long since abandoned any pretense of valuing the individual soldier. They were there to patch up the ones who could still fight and offer a last cigarette to the ones who couldn't. Now they watched American nurses, women who they had been told were frivolous and weak, tending to their wounds with a gentle efficiency that was utterly disarming. They saw doctors arguing over the best course of treatment for a German NCO, their debate as passionate as if he were their own brother. This meticulous, impartial preservation of life was a spectacle of such profound strangeness that it induced a kind of vertigo. It felt like a violation of the natural laws of war. They felt a confusing cocktail of emotions. There was gratitude, a simple, animal thankfulness for the cessation of pain. But it was quickly soured by a deep and corrosive humiliation. To be cared for so completely by your enemy was to be rendered utterly powerless, to be made a child. It was an acknowledgement of their own side's failure on a level they had never considered. Their mighty war machine, the pride of the Reich, could not provide for its own soldiers what this soft army provided for its prisoners. The awe was undeniable. They would watch mesmerized as a C-47 transport plane landed on a nearby airstrip, a flying ambulance that would ferry the most critically wounded, again, both American and German, to proper hospitals in England or France. The sheer casual display of logistical supremacy was breathtaking. Their own Luftwaffe was a phantom. Their own supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Here, the Americans commanded the very air, using it not just to deliver bombs, but to deliver salvation. This realization bred a dark, gnawing envy. It was an envy not for material goods, but for the system that produced them, for the society that valued its people enough to build such a system. And with that envy came the first, terrifying seeds of respect. Not for the American soldier as a warrior, they still clung to the belief in their own martial superiority, but for the American as an organizer, an engineer, a logistician. They were fighting a nation that waged war like a vast, unstoppable industrial process, a process that, chillingly, included the humane and efficient repair of its broken parts, even those of the enemy. The foundation of their world was not just cracked, it was beginning to crumble, and they could feel the abyss of doubt opening beneath them. If this story resonates with you, click the like button to help it reach a wider audience. Your engagement is crucial for the channel's growth. The psychological impact deepened with every passing day. The German soldiers, recovering from their wounds, were often put to work on light duties around the hospital and the adjoining POW camp. This proximity gave them a continuous, unfiltered view of the American way of war and, more importantly, the American way of being. They saw medics who, after a grueling 12-hour shift, would organize a baseball game. They heard them laugh, a sound so jarringly normal in this landscape of pain that it felt like a hallucination. They watched as these same men who had hours before held the hands of dying soldiers now joked and argued over a game, their youth and vitality a stark contrast to the grim, aged beyond their years' weariness of the German veterans. The Germans, who had been taught that life was a constant, heroic struggle, that joy was a frivolous distraction from duty, observed this with a mixture of contempt and fascination. This casual humanity was the most confusing weapon of all. They had been prepared for brutality, for hatred, for the cold indifference they themselves practiced. They were not prepared for kindness. They were not prepared for the medic who, seeing a German prisoner shivering, gave him his own spare blanket without a word. They were not prepared for the cook who slipped them extra rations, muttering something about "a man's gotta eat." Each of these small acts was a hammer blow against the walls of their indoctrination. Propaganda had painted the Americans as inhuman monsters or degenerate weaklings. The reality was something far more complex and dangerous. They were just men. Men who, despite being locked in a struggle for survival, had somehow managed to hold on to a part of themselves that the Germans had been forced to sacrifice long ago. This forced a painful self-reflection. They looked at their own officers, at the rigid, unyielding hierarchy of their own army. They remembered the casual cruelty, the summary executions for minor infractions, the belief that fear was the only effective motivator. They compared it to what they saw here. They saw American officers eating the same food as the enlisted men, speaking to them with a degree of familiarity that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. They saw a chain of command that seemed to run on respect and competence rather than terror. The medic, running unarmed into a firefight, was not an anomaly. He was the ultimate expression of this system. He did it not because a commissar would shoot him if he didn't, but because he believed it was his duty. He did it because his comrades, his officers, and his entire nation expected him to. He was a symbol of a trust that ran from the highest general down to the lowest private, a trust in the value of every single life. For the German prisoners, who had been raised in a system that preached the supremacy of the collective while treating the individual as utterly expendable, this was a revelation so profound it bordered on heresy. The war, they were beginning to realize, was not just being fought on the battlefield, but in the very souls of the men who fought it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden corners of history. The culmination of this psychological transformation, the moment the final wall of their ideology came crashing down, was not a grand, dramatic event. It was a small, quiet moment of observation. A new batch of wounded arrived one evening, churned out by a vicious local skirmish. The hospital was overwhelmed. Medics, doctors, and orderlies scrambled to keep up with the tide of broken bodies. Among the prisoners was a young German, no older than 17, his face pale and slick with the sweat of shock. His leg had been mangled by a mine and he was bleeding out, his life draining into the dirt floor of the receiving tent. A single American medic, a man the other prisoners had nicknamed Sarge for his weary but authoritative demeanor, was trying to stabilize him. The boy was thrashing, crying out in German, delirious with pain and fear. Sarge worked feverishly, trying to apply pressure to the severed artery, but the boy's panicked movements made it impossible. An American officer, a captain, rushed over. He took one look at the situation, at the overflowing tent, at the dwindling supplies of plasma. He looked at the German boy, then at the medic. By the cold, brutal logic of war, the boy was a lost cause. He was an enemy, and the resources being spent on him were desperately needed for American soldiers with a better chance of survival. The other German prisoners watched, their breath held. They knew what would happen in their own army. The boy would be given a massive dose of morphine and left to die quietly, to make room. It was the only logical, practical thing to do. The captain put a hand on the medic's shoulder. The German prisoners braced themselves for the inevitable order, but the captain didn't order the medic to stop. Instead, he knelt on the other side of the German boy. He began speaking to him in broken, clumsy German, words learned from a phrasebook, telling him he was safe, that they would help him. He helped the medic hold the boy still, his uniform quickly becoming soaked in the blood of his enemy. He called for another unit of plasma, diverting it from a less critical case. Together, the American captain and the American medic fought to save the life of one anonymous German teenager, a boy who, just hours before, had been trying to kill them. They worked as a team, their shared purpose transcending rank, nationality, and the hatred that was supposed to define their conflict. The other German prisoners watched in absolute, unbroken silence. Their cynicism, their suspicion, their deep-seated belief in the fundamental brutality of man, all of it evaporated in that moment. What they were witnessing was not just medicine, it was a ceremony. It was a powerful, undeniable declaration of a different set of values. The medic's Red Cross was not just a marker of his role, it was the symbol of an entire civilization. It was a symbol of a nation so powerful, so wealthy, so confident in its own moral foundations that it could afford to be humane in the very heart of inhumanity. It was a symbol of industrial might that could produce enough plasma, enough medicine, enough skilled personnel to treat not only its own, but its enemies too. It was a symbol of a humanism they had been taught was a weakness, but which they now saw as an incredible, unshakable source of strength. Their Führer had promised them a Reich built on blood and iron, but here, in this bloody tent, they saw a power built on blood and plasma, and they knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone which one was stronger. In that quiet, desperate struggle for one boy's life, they saw the entire war in microcosm and understood, for the first time, why they were doomed to lose. If this story has moved you, please share it with others who appreciate history. It helps our community grow and allows us to create more content like this. The war ended, the mushroom clouds over Japan brought a final, terrifying end to the global conflict. The German prisoners, now no longer a threat, were eventually repatriated. They returned to a homeland that was a mirror image of their own broken bodies and shattered minds. Their cities were rubble, their government was gone, their ideology was a disgrace. They were ghosts returning to a graveyard. In the years that followed, as they struggled to rebuild their lives from the ashes, the memories of the war became a constant, haunting presence. They remembered the roar of the guns, the faces of their fallen comrades, the bitter taste of defeat. But for this particular group of men, the ones who had passed through the American field hospitals, another set of memories burned just as brightly, if not more so. They remembered the quiet competence of the medics. They remembered the smell of antiseptic, a scent more alien and powerful than any perfume. They remembered the sight of plasma dripping slowly into a man's veins, a small, mundane miracle. These memories became a secret touchstone, a private truth that they could not share with those who had not been there. How could they explain it? How could they describe to their families, to their fellow Germans, that one of their most profound and lasting impressions of the hated American enemy was not of their tanks or their planes, but of their stubborn, systematic, and overwhelming compassion? To speak of it would sound like a betrayal, like a justification for the enemy's victory. So, for the most part, they kept it to themselves. But the experience had irrevocably changed them. It had planted a seed of doubt that in the fertile soil of post-war Germany grew into a new understanding of the world. They had been taught that strength was found in ruthlessness, in the suppression of sentiment, in the singular pursuit of power. They had seen, firsthand, a different kind of strength, a strength that came from valuing human life, a strength that was expressed in the vast, complex, and expensive machinery of healing. They had seen an army that was powerful enough to be kind. This realization did more to denazify them than any official re-education program ever could. It was an ideological defeat that was far more personal and profound than the military surrender at Reims. Their system had not only failed to conquer the world, it had failed to even care for its own sons in a way that their enemy cared for its prisoners. The image of the American medic running through the snow unarmed to save the life of an enemy became the lasting symbol of their war. It was the memory that explained the defeat not in terms of strategy or tactics, but in terms of fundamental values. It was a testament to the fact that their glorious thousand-year Reich had been defeated not just by superior firepower, but by a superior idea, the idea that every human life has worth, and that preserving it even in the midst of total war is not a weakness, but the ultimate expression of power. For these survivors, the war did not end with the last shot fired, but with the quiet, persistent memory of an enemy who chose, against all logic, to heal rather than to kill.